So welcome again to Water Conservation and Harvesting, brought to you by the AMI Farm at Augusta Health. So glad you're with me this morning. We begin our discussion this morning by thinking a little bit more about the power of water. Water is the great nurturer. Of course, it is necessary for plant growth, for nurturing new life, but it also has the power to carve canyons, like in the Grand Canyon you see in that small photo. And it really comes down to speed, the difference between the gentle aspect of water as a nurturer and the ferocious power of water to carve through landscapes. Now, conventional wisdom about managing water in your home landscape was that we wanted to create a channel to guide that water downstream through the watershed as quickly as possible. But now we've really rethought the best practices for managing water. And instead, we choose to slow, sink, and spread the water throughout the landscape. And we'll show you why as we go on. Now here's a bonus question. Can anyone name our watershed? And do you know why conservation is particularly important in this watershed? Now's a great time to test out the chat box. We are in the Chesapeake Bay. How do I go to my next slide? There we are. We are here in the Chesapeake Bay, and the larger star that you see on the map there is the Shenandoah Valley, where we are, where most of us are, where I am this morning. Bad news, we're endangered. So our pink subsection, if you are in the Stanton, Augusta, Waynesboro area, is the Potomac-Shenandoah watershed subsection. Now, if you're familiar with AMI, our mountain farm in Highland County is the smaller blue star. We're unique because we're at a triple watershed divide, sending water into the Potomac, the James, as well as down into West Virginia, into the Greenbrier, and out into the Atlantic through, well, all to the Atlantic, but out into the Bay in Mexico. So why do I say that the Chesapeake Bay is particularly endangered? It's because it's vulnerable through a couple of different factors. And sadly, agriculture is one of the biggest one, especially conventional agriculture. So we have a lot of farms around us that grow through conventional practices with monocultures, planting a field full of the exact same crop, pesticide use, lots of animal ag that produces a lot of runoff. And runoff, that is water moving quickly through a landscape and pulling a lot of pollutants in its wake, is particularly harsh around the Chesapeake Bay because the bay is very shallow. So runoff carrying topsoil, fertilizer, other byproducts throughout our region, and you can see on this map that we're talking from New York down to Southern Virginia. Runoff washes into the bay from all of these areas, and the bay is shallow enough that it intensifies the effects, particularly as the sunlight on the shallow expanse of water heats things up into a nasty kind of toxic soup for the bay, with detrimental consequences to the ecosystem. Now, the bright spot in this is that though conventional agriculture is one of our greatest risk factors for the health of the bay, sustainable agriculture can work wonders in removing those contaminants and retaining nutrients. So healthy soil has a much higher capacity to hold on to water and nutrients, and living diverse root networks can act like filters to both slow the movement of that water and to catch and remediate those contaminants. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So when you have heard about water conservation, we usually hear about it in the sense of don't leave the water running while you brush your teeth. But today we're going to talk a bit more about the landscape scale of water conservation. And there are 5 factors that you can use in your home landscape to limit the runoff. That's that fast water that pulls all of the things that it picks up along the way, whether that's soil and soil erosion, whether that's chemical pollutants, carries it with it down the watershed. So 5 factors to limit runoff. The first is to limit your impermeable surfaces. Those are surfaces that water cannot sink through. So it includes things like roofs, driveways, but also turf grass. Turf grass has a very dense network of roots that the water tends to slide on top of it rather than sinking in. Native grasses do a little better in that respect, but a more diverse subsection of plants rather than a monoculture of just lawn does even better. The second factor is to keep your soil healthy. That means keeping living, healthy soil with a vibrant network of roots, worms, other soil life. We'll talk more about that. Mulching, covering the surface of your soil, can have a huge impact in holding that soil down and slowing the drainage of water through the medium. And it also helps to limit evaporation. Catchment strategies are part 2 of this presentation, so we're going to talk a whole lot about that in just a moment. And choose your plants wisely. Natives give you a huge leg up here, and so does increasing diversity in your planting. It's also worth considering grouping your plants by their irrigation needs so that you're not overwatering something that doesn't need much just because it's next to a more thirsty plant. Remember, all of this comes back to our 3 principles of slow, sink, and spread the movement of water through our landscapes. Are there any questions so far? Great. So now we're going to move into the section on harvesting water, how to put our rainwater to work. So as we move into this next section, I invite you to ask yourself a few questions. Can you picture the current movement of water through your landscape? What's your roof line like? Where do your gutters let out? What kind of slope do you have to consider? And what's growing on that slope? Is there any persistent ponding in your landscape after rain? All of these factors will come into play as we work through the various strategies. Sounds like someone's got a crackly microphone. So if you want to mute the microphone, it should be at the bottom of your screen. And you can always unmute yourself if you have a question later on. So now we're moving into a few different strategies to store water. And we really have a choice about the way we're storing that water, whether above or below the surface of our landscape. Water catchment strategies can be divided into 2 categories: storing water in the soil, which encompasses keylines, swales, and gardens, and storing water at the surface. And in that category, we'll talk a lot about rain barrels. They're roughly organized from most intensive to least intensive in the order we're going to talk about them. And that's intensity to you in an effort to install them. Now, the reason I would want to store water beneath the soil, which is sometimes called bioretention, is naturally that under the soil is where my plant's roots are. In general, plants are better at knowing what they need than people are. And so if we can get a healthy amount of water underneath the soil, our roots can be trusted to take what they need when they need it and pass on the rest, especially if they're roots of native plants. But notice I said under the soil and not on top of it. As I'm sure you know, water ponding at soil level, creating puddles in your yard, is not a good thing. It does no good to the roots, and in fact, it takes up all the airspace in the soil, which, it goes without saying, is a bad thing for our plants. So the first of the strategies that we're going to discuss is contour and keyline. The point of keyline design is to create invitations at just the right place as water moves down a slope so that the water drains through the soil to storage beneath at an even rate across our landscape. This is one of the trickiest theoretical concepts in permaculture design, and it's rarely the most practical to implement on a home scale. So we're not going to go into a ton of detail here. But to understand keyline, we have to start with contour. So I don't know if y'all can see my hands right now because I may start talking with my hands. I can't see you. So just know that if I start talking nonsense and you get confused, you can always stop me and we'll back up and try again. So contour refers to a line across a landscape where every point on the line is at the same elevation. Contour is what you're looking at when you're looking at a topographic map. Each of those lines stays at the same elevation across the landscape. The point of contours and keylines, and we're about to get to keyline, is to find the best place to interrupt the motion of water down a slope and send it in another direction to slow the spread of the water. So imagine a single drop of rain rolling down a sloped roof until it reaches the gutter. Now, to find your contour, there are a couple of different ways that you can easily do this at home if you don't have a professional map maker to come and make a topographic map of your property. Although I should mention that Google Maps does a fairly good job of that. But you'll generally want more definition than they give you. For example, mini maps only show every 40 feet of elevation change, and for our purposes, 10 is more useful. So the first way that you can find contour is to use a carpenter's level. Mark a point, pivot your level to maintain plumb, keep the bubble in the same place on it, and add a flag at the end of the level, pivot again, add another flag. That should keep you roughly on contour as you move across the landscape laterally. The tool in the photo here is an A-frame, and it works on the same principle. The 2 feet finding level or finding contour will result in the string hanging down with perfect straightness. So you walk that tool across the landscape and know that each point you find should be roughly at the same elevation as the one that preceded it. Then you go up about 10 feet in elevation and do it all again. It can be a little bit time consuming, but it's a really reliable way to get a sense of how your landscape is in slope. Now the point of keyline design is to, oops, I'm about to read you the same slide. So the keyline comes from the invention of the keyline plow, which cuts tiny little slits of gutters into our hillside to let the rainwater drain in. I'm sorry, I've mixed up my note pages. So before we go here, let me say a few more things. So you found your contour lines about every 10 vertical feet across your landscape. And if your property is steep, you have a lot of lines, but if it's relatively flat, you only have a few. So we started with the image of a raindrop rolling down a sloped roof. Now imagine that we have gutters placed every 10 feet on that roof. Adapt your mental gutters to a hillside to give them a little bit more dimension. And remember that each of our gutters is spreading water laterally, but also overflowing to continue sending some water down the roof across the whole length. So in theory, water is touching every part of our roof. It's not speeding up in any particular spot to carve a channel that knocks off the shingles. And that's important to remember. Is anybody lost? It's okay if you're lost. Okay. Seems like everyone is still with me. So the point of the Keyline design is that we are going to work from darn it, I'm going to get this right once I find my notes. There we are. So this guy in Australia, whose name was, I believe, P.O. Yeoman, invented this thing called the Keyline plow. And what it does is you drag it behind a tractor like any other plow, and it cuts tiny little slits like gutters into our hillside to let rainwater drain in. It's adapted from contour in the fact that whereas a contour line gets closer to the line above it as the hillside gets steeper, a keyline always stays parallel. So you can see on a real landscape like the one on the screen, that's not always our starting point. Some of the topographic lines are really close together and others are wider apart. So you can see how that might turn into a problem if I were, for example, planning to plant a row of apple trees on each line. At some point, my trees are going to knock into each other and not have enough room for their roots. So that would get me in trouble. So Keyline adapts contour to find a single starting point, which is called the key point, and then repeats the pattern from there. The key point is one of the trickier things to find. Generally, it's the point where convex starts to become concave. So you can see it's got a dashed line through it here on our screen. The key point is the inside of that dip. And from your key point, you follow contour once and then remain parallel with it for the rest of your hillside. So don't worry too much about finding your property's key point though, because the plows cost about $10,000. So it's not super practical for home gardeners. But it is important to know that this is one of the few strategies that's really appropriate for large-scale farms with very steep hillsides to combat erosion and to hydrate the soil really evenly. And the principles involved explain several of the strategies for distributing and sinking the maximum amount of water into our landscapes. And the next one that we're going to talk about are swales. So to understand swales, we build off the concept of contours that we just discussed. And here we're taking the idea of cutting a gutter into our hillside and combining it with a little berm to absorb the water when our gutter overflows. So here's a video that explains it much more effectively than I can.
A swale is a water harvesting ditch on contour with a soft contour mound on the lower side. It interrupts the water flow as it comes across the landscape and stops it on contour perfectly level, and the soft mound on the lower side soaks the water into the landscape and it plumes it through the landscape as a sponge very, very slowly. This is the essence of creating swales that harvest water in the most passive way and hold the water up for as long as possible, as high as possible, and create the most potential for productivity. The water that plumes down the hill from swale soakage continues to move at right angle to contour very slowly through the landscape. As you set more and more of these systems up, it's inevitable that eventually some of this water hits impervious layers that are almost horizontal, and where they meet the surface of the landscape profile, accumulated water starts to spring out in the middle to lower slopes. This is a way we actually recreate or invent completely new spring lines in the landscape. And that's another set of advantage that we can put swales to use for all sorts of extra water flows and productivity.
So a swale is a really intriguing option to take water that could become problematic as it quickly moves down a hill and distribute it in a gentle way so that it's, instead of carving a channel through the landscape, really feeding and nurturing a much wider subsection of the landscape than it might otherwise. But swales sometimes get overused in the wrong places by people who are just getting excited about permaculture. They're one strategy that's available to fix a problem, but they don't work everywhere. Here's a graphic from permaculturist Ben Falk to help evaluate if a swale might be the right strategy for your landscape. As you can see, it works best on a more gentle slope. A very steep slope will overcome the swale and ride right up that slope of our berm without sinking in. It's a good way to fix compacted or substandard soils. You don't really need it if you've already got fertile, deep, well-drained soil that would be great for growing. And we can use it to kind of heal a brittle or fragile ecosystem where we often get damaging hard and high-inch rains. But it works best if you don't have to maintain it with large pieces of machinery. You would not be able to effectively drive a tractor over a berm. It would really just get in your way. So it's better for a less mechanized system of production. It's not the kind of thing that you would want in your farmland that you have to intensively maintain with annuals, mow all the time. So it's not always the right choice, but in some places it can really work wonders for your landscapes. Before we move to rain gardens, are there any questions on keyline, contour, and swales? Okay, if questions arise, feel free to type them into the chat box or to unmute your microphone and ask aloud. Either is fine. So now we're moving into the more practical methods for home use, the kind of projects that can be implemented in a couple of weekends and really be beautiful and rewarding as well as good for the ecosystem. This is a rain garden, and you'll see that this graphic comes from Washington State University, thus the reference to the Puget Sound. And a rain garden is a really fantastic way to put our precipitation to use and create something beautiful from it too. It enlarges the concept that informed the swale. It's a shallow depression in our existing slope that's strategically planted to increase its ability to manage water. But it's not a marsh. We don't want to hold that water and keep it at the surface. Instead, it's a drain field. So there are some really important benefits to planting a rain garden. There's the water conservation aspect. The plants inside will seldom need any extra irrigation, and it also helps to enhance and fill our natural aquifer. There's filtration because different root patterns and depths work like a really effective filter to pull out large sized contaminants, as well as the ability of those roots to sequester certain minerals and chemicals in the soil helps to remediate any chemical contamination. And I should mention here that the form and function of rain gardens are inspired by natural meadows, which do this really effectively in the wild. It helps to reduce ponding, which reduces mosquitoes, which is always a wonderful thing. And they're 30 to 40% more efficient than a turf lawn at dealing with heavy water events. Of course, they're also beautiful, and a diversity of plants makes for a diversity of wildlife. Now, these are all benefits that hold true in suburban areas. In urban areas, you can also add temperature control to this list. So I'm really fascinated with rain gardens because my first exposure to them was helping to create one on a vacant lot in inner city Baltimore. It was very memorable. I was working for AmeriCorps at the time and was pulled in to transform this unused lot in a kind of a blighted neighborhood. We had 2 hours and probably 50 students from across the city to transform this lot from a vacant place that people threw drug paraphernalia to a beautiful rain garden before the mayor arrived to give a press conference. Because the soil there was super compacted, we had to shovel most of it out and shovel in a few truckloads of sand and compost, and plant probably 50 trees, and it was so hot, surrounded by the blacktop, that I remember being told that one of the benefits was that the introduction of the trees and the ability to mediate water in this new rain garden could drop the temperature on that street by several degrees, and it needed it. So we managed to just barely finish the rain garden in time, and the mayor arrived to give a press conference, and I barely managed to avoid fainting in the audience of the press conference, stumbled over to somebody's stoop and discreetly blacked out. They came out to say, excuse me, what's wrong here? But all was well. The rain garden was beautiful. I'd like to see it now someday that it is working as it should. It was definitely a memorable introduction to the topic. So that's all I'll say about that. So to make your rain garden really successful, you have to choose the right place for it. And as with contours and keylines and swales, observation is so important here to choose the right place for your feature. And you need to know a little bit about the existing patterns of runoff in your particular landscape, and particularly if they're creating any problems. So rain gardens are typically sited close to your home so that they can catch what comes off of your roof line, but you don't want them too close. You want your rain garden at least 10 feet away from your foundation, and that's a strategic choice because in most cases, your home has been placed at the top of your micro watershed. And our charge here is to disperse potential problems before they start. So we want to catch the water and sink it for the plants to distribute before it heads downhill, speeding up and creating a channel. The other reason that we don't want it directly against the foundation of our house is that we are creating a depression here that water is going to sink into several different directions. We definitely don't want to direct it back into our foundation, into our basement and crawl space, and create problems for ourselves. Another point to talk about here is that if you have any places in your landscape where water is already ponding and puddling, we know that that is a place where the soil does not admit great drainage. So that's not where I want to put the rain garden. Instead, I'd like to put my rain garden above that area where hopefully drainage is not as problematic and I can slow down the water before it gets to my problem area. So as with swales, this is one option of the many you have, and it's not necessarily the right option for every landscape. So this cool flow chart comes from the folks at Missouri Botanical Gardens, and it shows that if all the factors don't line up, there may be a better choice than rain gardens. But if you're not working with a woodland, you have good drainage, and we're going to get to the percolation test piece in just a moment, and your site is on a gentle, moderate slope, then designing and building a rain garden could be really effective and really rewarding. Our next charge is to choose the right size. So first you want to identify all the impervious surfaces that would contribute to your rain garden, which for your home is probably at least one side of your roof, but in a commercial context, it might be a parking lot or a driveway. And plan for between 10 to 30% of that square footage to channel into your rain garden. So 150 to 450 square feet is a typical size for a single family home rain garden. You can get really technical about the size and the square footage if you love to work numbers, and it's not really necessary, but some people love to get into all of the science behind it. And I'm going to send around a full guidebook from the Chesapeake Stormwater Network when I send out the webinar recording later this week, and that will give you the specifics and calculations and lots of examples that are calibrated to our watershed. But remember, even a small impact is a benefit for our landscape. And this image is a really good example of that. You can see that this cute little house only has a tiny little lot, so they planned a very small rain garden, even though it looks like most of their roof line does channel to this spot. So they planned a small rain garden because they have a small lot, but they also have a path for overflow built in. So if they have a really, really heavy rain, say 2 inches in an hour, they're not going to be able to catch all of the water. But they're still going to have an effect in slowing some of the water that does come through, refilling the natural aquifer, and then passing on the water that remains so that it doesn't create a problem. And a fun fact, on average, 34,300 gallons of rain falls on a 30 by 40 foot roof in our area each year. It's a lot of water to move. Another factor to take into consideration with rain gardens and really with the movement of any rainwater through your landscape is your soil composition. Soil composition is not always the same across your landscape, and different soil types have vastly different abilities to manage water. If you have a choice between soil that's loose or soil that's clay, avoid the clay. Clay has the least ability to capture and remediate water. But if all of your soil is clay, for example, my home is in Eastern Virginia, and we have thick, sticky red clay everywhere. If all of your soil is clay, you can take into account working with a larger surface area to help make up for the lesser permeability of your soil. Or you can even amend your soil by changing its texture with mixing in some compost in an extreme case, even mixing in some sand to help facilitate the movement of water, the drainage of water through that soil. Fortunately, in the Shenandoah Valley, we have pretty balanced soil. So as long as you're not dealing with an area of high soil compaction, you probably won't have to deal too much with amending your soil. How do you know how well your soil drains? There are a couple different tests. So you can ignore the last one, the pH test. We don't need it in this context. But the first three are really useful, and in particular, the percolation test. Squeezing your soil helps you know how well it aggregates. If it's all sticky and clumpy, you know that it's actually a great sign of healthy soil life, but it may slow down drainage of water. If you have lots of worms in your soil, you know that your soil is healthy and living, and you also know that the channels that those worms dig as they move through the soil will help water to sink in. But the most pertinent test here is the percolation test. And you can conduct a percolation test by digging a hole about the size of a coffee can, 6 inches wide, 6 inches deep, in the center of where you plan on creating a rain garden. It's best to do this test when the surrounding soil is saturated, like the day after a rain. But if there hasn't been any rainfall recently, you can always do this test twice to make up with it. You fill the hole with water and thoroughly saturate the surrounding soil with a hose. Wait for the hole to drain and fill it to the top a second time. If it's all drained away in 24 hours and the water's gone, you're good to go, because the minimum percolation rate that's suitable for a rain garden is about 1/4 inch per hour, and 6 inches divided by 24 hours is 1/4 inch per hour. So if you dig your hole the size of a coffee can, fill it up, and the next day it's gone, you know you've got enough drainage to have a successful rain garden. And the last piece is choosing your vegetation for that rain garden. Our goals here are building variety while also choosing the right place in the moisture spectrum for each plant. The deepest portion of the bowl that we're going to create should have vegetation that's happy with wet feet. But the downslope rim of the bowl is going to be drought tolerant because most of the water's already been caught by the time it gets there. We want to plant densely, and we also want to, when possible, choose native plants, and even better, native perennials. Once we get everything in here, we're not going to want to wade through our plant matter to do a lot of maintenance. And we probably won't need a lot of maintenance once it gets established because the dense planting crowds out weeds. Perennials are best for that reason, and also because they are naturally adapted to live in our area and are more used to the range of moisture that we can get, the periods of flood and drought that are so common in this region. Are there any questions about rain gardens before we move to the next section? I'll be sending out a full guide with the recording from this webinar that will answer questions you don't even know that you have yet. But for now, this is probably the most common and the easiest place to start if you're interested in capturing precipitation on a home scale. A rain barrel is a great weekend project that can hold on to some of the water naturally passing through the system in a time of heavy rain and save it to redistribute when you water your lawn or garden in a drought. You can buy the whole thing pre-made for about $100 or put it together pretty cheaply for about $15, especially if you have a donated barrel. It's also pretty easy to link together a chain of barrels for more holding capacity. Now, every rain barrel system has a couple of common elements. You're going to want to direct the rain from your downspout into your barrel and filter the movement of water into the barrel so that you don't catch the leaves from your downspout as well. You want to lift your barrel up enough that you can get your watering can under there. You want an overflow pipe in case too much water is moving through the system in a time of heavy rain, and a way to direct that overflow away from your foundation. And you want to be able to drain your barrel in the winter so it doesn't freeze and expand and create holes in your system. This drawing came from a past AMI fellow, Shannon Matthews, who developed a gravity-fed rain barrel chicken waterer system using a small shed roof on the chicken coop to capture natural rainwater and reduce one of her chores. Okay, so I have a question about, with rain gardens, how do you calculate how many plants per square foot? That's something that you're going to want to balance based on the particular plants that you choose. And anything that you are buying as a transplant or raising as a transplant, because it does tend to be a better option to transplant into a rain garden than it does to start from seed. You should have some instructions about how closely you can interplant. So in general, the rule of thumb that I tell kids when they're starting vegetables is you want about as much space for the roots as twice the volume of the top. I would push that a little bit more and plant a little bit closer than that with a rain garden, because the crisscrossing interwoven network of roots is really something that we're going for to help increase the filtration, as well as to create those root spaces in the soil below. So I would check the recommendations from each plant and then go a little bit tighter than that. I hope that's helpful. So back to rain barrels. Keep in mind that your rain barrel, especially if you have only one, will fill up really fast in heavy rain. For every inch of rain that falls on 1 square foot of your roof, you can collect just over a half gallon of rainwater, 0.6 of a gallon. So for example, if you had a 10 by 10 shed, just 100 square feet, you would get 60 gallons of rainwater during a 1-inch rain. So if you were to harness the water off a 2,000 square foot home, you would have 1,200 gallons from 1 inch of rain. That means that the kind of barrel that you see in the aisle at Lowe's is not going to catch all that. So you definitely need to have a plan for your overflow to send that water through your watershed in a productive way, rather than, for example, into the foundation of your house. Now, there is a wealth of DIY guidance online and through YouTube if you're interested in making your own barrel. As I said, it can be done in about an hour for $10 to $15. You can make it from a donated barrel. You can make it from a large plastic trash can. There's a lot of ways that you can get creative with the ways to capture and hold this rainwater. But do remember that it has passed over your usually asphalt shingled roof. It's not going to harm your plants, but I would not drink it myself without extra filtration. Another good tip is to drain your barrel in the winter so it won't be damaged by freezing and thawing. Any questions on rain barrels. We've barely scratched the surface of all there is to learn about conservation, catchment, and ecological design today, but I encourage you to dig into the wealth of resources available and to imagine the potential in your landscape. I really love this graphic from the Missouri Botanical Garden that shows how you can combine several of the methods we've talked about today, and even some we didn't get to, with an eye to conservation and water catchment and filtration. Things like green roofs, like replacing your lawn with more diverse vegetation or even a vegetable garden, amending your soil for great soil health and mulching your soil, creating a woodland on your own property. All of these things have a cumulative effect to slow down the water as it moves through your private ecosystem and to have less water at one time and cleaner, healthier, slower moving water impact our watershed as a whole. And all of those are things to work toward. So that concludes what I've got for this webinar, but I'm happy to take any further questions that folks might have. Also want to mention our next webinar workshop from AMI and the AMI Farm at Augusta Health is Your Garden Year, Vegetable Storage and Preservation. We'll be talking about ways to plan your vegetable garden so that those bumper crops of tomatoes and hot peppers in the summer can last all year, and there never comes a day that you are out of vegetables. So if you're interested in that class, any of our other community workshops, or want to suggest a topic, you can register at amifellows.org. And there's also my email address so that if you have questions or comments later on, you can always reach out to me, Grayson at amifellows.org. Happy to stay on the line for a few moments in case anyone should have further questions, and really appreciate you being with us here today. That is actually a great point. If you have very sandy soil, which has not been my experience, so I forgot to mention it, you probably will want to amend your soil because sand moves water through too quickly, doesn't hold on to enough moisture to grow a wealth of the diverse vegetation we'd like. So if you have super sandy soil, I would add some serious compost to balance out that soil, slow the movement of water through it, and make sure that there is sufficient nutrition and moisture catching for healthy plants inside. Thanks to all of you for hanging with me through some technical difficulties, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Feel free to email if you've got further questions, and you will all get the recorded presentation as well as some further resources in the future. Oh, thank you for asking if AMI needs volunteers. We can't take any yet until the stay-at-home order is lifted, but beginning in mid-June, AMI will definitely take on some volunteers to help us out at the AMI Farm at Augusta Health with vegetable harvesting and distribution, even some flower arranging. We try and keep it diverse and fun. Okay, at this point, I'm going to stop recording us. Feel free to send any further questions.